Well, every once in a while, you come across someone who just understands the big picture. We've got that tonight with Gregg, Braden, author of The Divine Matrix, The Science of Miracles as well. We're going to talk with Gregg about bridging time, space, miracles, and belief. I'm looking forward to this. He's next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Let me give you a little bit of Gregg Braden's background for you. A former senior computer systems designer for Martin Marietta Aerospace. He is a computer geologist for Phillips Petroleum, technical operations manager for Cisco Systems. And Gregg is considered as a pioneer in bridging the wisdom of our past with science, healing, and peace of our future. For at least 20 years, probably more than that, Gregg has searched high mountain villages, remote monasteries, forgotten texts to uncover their timeless secrets. Now, to date, his work has led to such paradigm-shattering books, The Isaiah Effect, The God Code, The Divine Matrix, Bridging Time, Space, Miracles, and Belief. He's come out with a new DVD series, of course, called The Science of Miracles. And we're going to talk with him about miracles and about the science behind it right now. And here he is, Gregg Braden. Hey, Gregg, how are you?
Well, good evening, George. It's a pleasure to hear your voice. I'm going to say happy 2008 to you and all of our friends listening tonight.
Gregg, the clock is just ticking. What's happening? Slow it down.
Hey, well, we were listening just before this program came on, and I heard your announcement that your contract's been extended until the end of time. So I'm going to say congratulations on that as well.
Yeah, just my luck for the end of time to be next week. But no, it's we're really happy with this. And
congratulations. We're lucky to have you, George, and I'm just thrilled to hear that.
You have done a remarkable job with your work. But you've really touched on something this time, Gregg, and it's a great night to talk with you about it coming out of the holidays with the science of miracles. And you've looked at it with a different perspective, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your reason for going into this, first of all.
Well, the reason that I'm going into all that we're doing, first of all, I think that you and our listeners probably know that by the time a book makes it to the shelves of a bookstore or a DVD is produced, that the information that was in that book or in that DVD is just the tip of the iceberg of a much broader body of information underlying all of that. And as authors, we have to choose what it is that and how we share that to bring our work to a greater visibility. What we know is that we're facing a time in the history of our country and the history of our world. Many people sense that something very different is happening now, and the experts are now telling us that is precisely the case, George. They're saying that this is an unprecedented time in the history of our planet, of our civilization. And the experts were called together for an amazing conference in the year 2005. And the results of this conference were so profound that they were actually published as a special edition of the journal Scientific American. It was titled Crossroads for Planet Earth in 2005. And the bottom line is that the experts, the scientists, the engineers, the social architects, the religious leaders, so many different disciplines, they all came together and they identified a number of scenarios ranging from disease and competition for resources to energy production and war. And what they said was that any of these scenarios alone have the power to forever change or possibly end civilization and the world as we know it. Any one of them alone. And what makes our time, this moment in history, so powerful and so profound is that all of these events are happening at the same time. And they said, we've got the next 8, maybe 10, 15 years to figure this out, or nothing else is really going to make much difference. The Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson identified our time in history, and I love the term. He says we're entering what he calls a bottleneck in time.
That is a good term.
He says it's a time when our resources and our ability to solve the problems of our day are going to be pushed to their limits. Boy, I can't believe that anybody doesn't feel that that's precisely what's happening right now. So that is the context within which we're looking at the science. Some of the science, George, is so new it hasn't made it into the textbooks yet. And many of the discoveries are validating some of our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions, the very traditions that were lost and edited from Western culture 1,700 years ago, but they've been preserved in some of the most pristine monasteries in some of the most remote parts of the world. And when we factor these discoveries into our time in history, George, it changes everything. So the reason I'm excited, and you can tell I'm excited about tonight, is because what we're going to talk about over these next couple of hours is so fundamental that there is nothing that any guest could bring to this program that is not somehow impacted by the discussion we're going to have tonight. Everything from the elections of the nations, to the peace between nations, to the healing of our bodies. It all comes back to our relationship to our world and in the universe and things that we're only beginning to understand.
Has science stumbled into this where, let's say, people who are experts in metaphysics knew this for years?
Well, I think what has happened is, first of all, I'm just going to preface this. I was trained in the hard sciences. I come from the world of science. I support the scientific method. And I'm not down on science, George. I think science has done some wonderful things.
No doubt.
For where we are in the world today, and it's allowed us to do things that were miracles in my grandfather's time. Before he died, he and I had a conversation where he told me that the new discoveries were happening so fast he just couldn't keep up with them. They were so amazing in his mind, he couldn't find a way to make sense of them. And it was all based in science. And as good as science is, what we're going to talk about tonight, George, is a couple of assumptions that were made over 100 years ago. And science is only about 300 years old in terms of the scientific method.
Right.
So we accept science as beginning around the time of when Newton formalized the laws of physics. That's when we say science actually began. Well, about 100 years ago, a series of experiments were conducted to settle the argument as to whether or not there's a field of energy that connects everything and whether or not we're connected with that field. The results of those experiments, in my opinion, were poorly interpreted. And they have set us on a false course, false assumptions in science that have led us into a series of dead ends and up against the brick wall in trying to explain the universe and the way we work within the universe. So the first false assumption, I'll say it right now, the first false assumption is that the space between things is empty. We now know that's absolutely not true. And the second false assumption is that our inner experiences, what we call thought, feeling, emotion, and belief, have no effect on the world beyond our bodies. And I'll tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. And this is what the new discoveries are showing us, and this is what changes everything.
Why is it important for us to grasp the fact that there may be things between spaces?
If in the assumption, first of all, we'll go back. The experiments that were conducted in the late 1800s, the very famous Michelson-Morley experiment, was conducted in 1887 publicly. What a lot of people don't know is that it had already been conducted in 1881 privately. And both times, the scientists came up with the same results. And the results suggested that everything is separate from everything else. If there's nothing filling the empty space, in lay terms, it suggests that everything is separate from everything else. And for that reason, what happens in point A has no effect on what happens in point B. If it looks like it does, it's only a coincidence. And we have an entire civilization now built upon the belief that what we do in one place doesn't have an effect or doesn't make any difference on something that's happening somewhere else. And that false assumption has written us, humankind, right out of the equations of the universe and how things work, and it's been the stumbling block for what we're calling this unified field theory that is yet to come together. There's some promising foundations out there, like string theory, superstring theory, that have been around since the 80s. But we've got to ask if these theories are the right path, if they're putting us on the right path, and they've been around for 20-plus years with the best minds of our time working on them and the best computing power we've ever had. Why are they still theories? Why have they failed to unify the forces of nature and provide a single story that explains the way the universe works and our role in the universe. And this is where everything's changing, George. This is why it's so exciting to be able to share this information tonight.
Could this also be the fact that there is this wireless internet out there in the universe or the multiverse that seems to connect everything?
I think that's precisely what I think is happening, George. It's so interesting. We talk about the great challenges of our time in history on the one hand. On the other hand, the inability of science to solve some of our problems. I tend to look at the big picture, and what I see happening is the very conditions that we've created, that science has created in our world, the conditions of disease and energy consumption, the possibility and threat of global war. Those very conditions are now driving us to understand who we are to survive the conditions that we've created. And I think what is so incredible about this time in history is this is when we get to find out what's real and what's not, what works and what doesn't. You know, we've heard from the mid 1980s and the harmonic convergence that we're all one, we're part of our world, and that we have powers beyond our most amazing dreams. And people would like to believe that.
You know, Greg, we might not have enough time to figure that. We won't have the time to make the mistake to figure it out. I think the clock has really ticked beyond where we should be.
Well, I agree with you, George, that the clock is ticking very quickly. I'm going to share tonight there is a global project that has just come online early in this year, the 2008, that I'm going to be able to talk about tonight, that allows every one of our listeners to participate and not just watch, not just observe, and not just guess as to whether or not they're having an effect, but to know that they're literally having an effect upon the fields of the earth, upon fields that are called coherent fields of the earth, that affect everything from the peace between nations to the health of our bodies to our sleep patterns to our relationships. I'm very excited to be sharing this information tonight. So we're going to cover a lot of ground over these next couple of hours.
And is it our ability to tap into this that changes these things for the better for us?
Well, yes. The fact is that we all already tap into it. The key is to do so consistently, predictably, and in a way that allows us to create the conditions in our lives that we're choosing to help us to become better people and have a better world. That's the bottom line to this ancient traditions that I'll be talking about that we found practiced in the monasteries and in the mountains of Egypt and the highlands of central China and Tibet. And now our own science is bearing out the very principles that have been preserved in these ancient wisdom traditions in non-scientific ways. So we walk into a monastery in the highlands of central China, and the monks aren't talking about quantum fields and holographic, experiences. What they do is they giggle because to them this is so basic. They giggle and they say, this is the way you work and this is the way your world works. And when we marry the wisdom that's been preserved in some of these remote and pristine, magnificent temples and monasteries and in some of the hardest to get to parts of the world, we marry what's been preserved there with the best science of our time is now telling us. What I believe we're finding, we're building for ourselves a spiritually based science that for some people sounds like an oxymoron, but I believe that this spiritually based science will meet the challenges that we're talking about tonight. And George, while I agree the clock is ticking, what we're finding is that the changes happen so quickly. I think we've got all the time we need, and now is the time to make the choices.
Now, Greg, these false assumptions of science that you talk about the space between things, sure, and also that our inner experiences have no effect on whatever happens. Both of these, of course, you're saying are false assumptions. I agree. How did we get to the point to understand that they're false assumptions? How did we know they were wrong?
Well, this is what's so interesting. It's like the great secret that everybody knows except us, George. And when you leave Western culture, what I've found in my first journey into the Egyptian mountains was in the mid 1980s, And what I found was that the people that were preserving this wisdom now, their traditions, some of them 5, 6, 7,000 years old, they begin with the place where our 300-year-old science has only arrived. In other words, science has spent 300 years debating whether or not there's a field of an essence that connects everything, and now they're just arriving at the place where scientists say, okay, the field's there, what do we do with it? And this is the place where these ancient traditions began, and they have spent 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 years learning how to apply this in their lives. So for me, this is the value of going into a living culture, because I'm not interpreting the hieroglyphs on an ancient temple wall. I'm speaking to another human, eye to eye, heart to heart, man to man, or woman to woman, and I'm asking them, usually through a translator, I'm asking them, when you just did this miraculous thing that I saw, when you levitated off the floor, or when you created this healing in the body of another person, how did you do it? You know, what did you do inside your body that created that effect? And if I don't understand,
do they know?
They do know. And if I don't understand what the answer is, I can ask them again and again until they either answer me or they get frustrated and ask me to leave the monastery. But they do know, and they're amazed that we do not, George. And this is why it's called the great secret. Everybody knows except us. Now, our own scientists have rediscovered the existence of this field. And for some of our listeners that would like to believe that this is true and maybe have never heard this, it's been published in mainstream journals. One of the most amazing was the journal Nature. A gentleman named Silvertooth reproduced the Michael Morley.
Silvertooth?
Silvertooth is his name. Yeah. Reproduced the experiments in 1986, the same experiments that Michelson Morley did back in 1887, and it's in the journal Nature, for people that know. It's a very prestigious journal.
Sure is.
Volume 322, August 1986, page 590. Silvertooth, under the auspices of the United States Air Force, reproduced the nearly 100-year-old experiments done by Michelson and Morley. The results of his experiments showed that there is, in fact, a field of energy that connects everything in our world, and the field was found to exist within the same parameters predicted 100 years earlier by Michelson Morley. So this should have made the cover of CNN and Time magazine, but people just aren't talking about it much.
Why not, Greg?
I think what I've found. And then I'll explain what I found, and then I'll explain why this may not be important. There is a reluctance in much of the mainstream science to accept what this means, because it changes everything, George. Entire careers, textbooks, ways of thinking have to be reevaluated if we know that this field is out there, on the one hand. But on the other hand, if we're waiting for science to acknowledge in the textbooks what we already know in our ancient and spiritual traditions and what the experiments are already showing us, we might wait another 10 years. But the beauty of what we're going to share tonight is that we don't have to wait for it to be acknowledged in the textbooks to apply it in our lives and in our world in a meaningful way. Now, we can explore it for another 100 years, and obviously we'll know more then than we know now. But I firmly believe that we can apply what we do know. And the experiments, the studies are showing us that we all have the ability to use this field in ways that we're only beginning to understand, for everything from personal healing in our bodies to collective healing in our world, and literally influencing the decisions of peace or war between nations. And documented studies have shown that this has happened in the past with quiet kinds of experiments. But these are new experiments now that are coming online, and we can all participate, and it changes everything about the way we think of our time in the world.
Okay, Greg, I'm looking forward to all of this. And when we come back, how about this? Who put the field there? Did science? Did it just happen? Or was there, as you say, perhaps the divine matrix behind all of this? I'm George Norrie, back in a moment with Gregg Braden on Coast to Coast AM. Did you pick up the After Dark newsletter yet? Maybe you got it for the holidays. Well, if you don't have it, you can call 1-888-727-5505, or you can also go online at coasttocoastam.com. You get 13 issues for the price of 12. It is a great magazine. It's a newsletter, but it comes in full color. Great stories. It's part of Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back, Gregg Braden, our guest. By the way, Gregg's website, linked up at coasttocoastam.com, but if you're driving around somewhere and, well, you don't have time to go and look at it today, it's GreggBraden.com. Gregg, who put this field there? How did it get there?
Wow, that's like the easy question that we usually start these interviews with. But the truth is, George, no one knows. No one knows where this field comes from. The assumption is, through the best scientific guess, is that the field has always been in existence and originated with the Big Bang, or whatever the primal release of energy that we believe it is that began this universe that we're living in right now, this space-time realm.
Right.
As the mathematics now say that space and time are so closely related. I'm a very visual person, and so if this helps our listeners, if we can kind of think of an infinitesimally small point in space and time that begins to enlarge and radiate in all directions simultaneously, as the space expands, part of that space is this field. And because the space is believed and the measurements suggest that the universe is still expanding, this field is still expanding and it's still in motion. And this ties back to the discoveries or the experiments that were done in 1887. The first 30 minutes of this program, we covered a lot of ground in a really short period of time, intentionally, because I wanted to be able to tie back into those ideas as we go through the evening. But for listeners that may not be familiar with this landmark experiment in 1887, a little over 100 years ago, it was called the Michelson-Morley experiment, and it was designed to solve the mystery and end the controversy that was raging in the scientific community in the late 1800s. Is there a field of energy that connects everything, or is that the idea that it exists, is that false? And at that time, this field was called the ether. And I'll let our listeners know, if you want to get laughed off of a scientific stage really fast today, you can bring up the term the ether. Because even today, even though we know the field is there, that term is not accepted as a valid description of the field. But the bottom line to this experiment is it was believed that the field is in motion. So if the motion could be detected, it would prove the existence of the field. This would be akin to our listeners. If you were to go outside and moisten a finger and hold it above your head right now, and if you felt no wind blowing against your finger, you concluded that no air exists. Of course, that's a false conclusion. Just because the wind isn't moving doesn't mean that the air doesn't exist. But this is the equivalent of the thinking behind this field in 1887. Well, from that time forward, even in the textbooks, if your kids are in school today, or those of you listening in school, if your textbooks will not acknowledge the existence of this field, even today, and it has been the great stumbling block that has prevented us from unifying the four forces of nature, the unified field theory that allows us to move forward in physics and solve some of the great mysteries in the universe.
Well, let's talk about some of these miracles,
sure,
Gregg. And first of all, your definition of a miracle is what?
Well, my definition, one of the first things I did when I was in the monasteries and they began talking about some of the things that were possible when we use this connection between our inner experiences and our outer world, the guides and the translators that were with me were calling them miracles. But it was interesting because the monks and the nuns and the abbots that do these things, they don't call them miracles at all. So I asked myself the same question. I said, well, just what is a miracle? A commonly accepted definition of a miracle is that it's something that appears inexplicable by the laws of nature as we understand those laws today. And it suggests that although the laws of nature that we understand are valid as far as they go, that we may be missing some. There may be laws or ways of seeing the universe that we simply have not accounted for. Because when we accept what it is that the experiments are showing us and what these people are demonstrating, it redefines miracles for me. It says that maybe there really aren't any miracles. There are only miracles until we understand why they're possible, and then they no longer become miracles. Then maybe they're a technology, an inner technology. There's a great mystery that is taught in many of the mystery schools that unfolds kind of like a flow chart. And when I do my presentations, I'm a very visual presenter, and my challenge on radio is to do this without those illustrations. But in the minds, in our listeners' minds tonight, if you can kind of visualize this flow chart, the spiritual traditions of our past have always said that there's something that we do in our bodies that triggers a process inside of us that interacts with the forces of nature and changes our physical world. That is shown as a flow chart. And if we don't understand what it is that we're doing and how it affects the forces of nature, when we see the effects, we say that we've seen a miracle. A tumor disappearing inside the body of a living human in less than 3 minutes. That would be medically considered a miracle. There is another flow chart. Now, based on what our own science has shown us, these are documented scientific experiments. They're published in accredited academic and scientific journals that say that heart-based feelings and emotions change the electrical and the magnetic fields in the human heart, and that when those fields change, they produce quantum effects that extend beyond the heart and change our physical world.
Well, isn't that also, Greg, like saying stress kills because it changes you?
Sure, it can be the same thing. When you say these two flow charts, what you're saying, George, the science has now said the same thing as the ancient spiritual mysteries. They're saying it in modern terms. And when we begin to understand this flow of energy, maybe they aren't miracles at all. Maybe it is a way of being that we're only beginning to understand. And the reason I'm so passionate about this, and I know you can hear it in my voice, is that this isn't just any old time in history. And it may be that our understanding, as we complete and bring our understanding of who we are full circle, that we can meet the challenges of our time, not just meet them. We don't want to just meet these challenges. We want to transcend to rise above the great challenges of our time so that we've got these future generations that we're talking about. And that is what I believe is at stake in terms of our willingness to accept what our own science has shown, what the ancient traditions have always held as true, and our willingness to marry these two great ways of knowing, science and spirituality, into a wisdom that will serve us and help us to become better people and create a better world today. And I think the conditions are pushing us to come to just that conclusion.
Well, I think so, and I want to talk about what I think is happening to people these days and see if you can help shed some light on that. But would you consider this a miracle? A truck driver falls asleep at the wheel. He's going over the side of a road, maybe over a cliff. He wakes up to see a hand on his steering wheel pulling him back onto the road. And there's nobody else in the cab. It's just him. And it's not his hand. Would that be a miracle, or is that something else, like an angelic intervention?
You know, well, the answer is yes. And that is the beauty and the crux of where we find ourselves at this time in history, George. It's what we allow ourselves to accept as the reality that we're living in right now. Are there intelligent forces in non-physical form that live in this field that connects all things? Do we communicate with them? Can they communicate with us? Can they affect our physical world? I believe the answer, from my experience of those, is yes. So when I see those things or I hear stories like that, well, I'm always in awe. I'm less surprised because the mechanism is in place and it makes perfect sense. That if we choose to live in an understanding that says that we are completely separate from everything else, there's no stuff that connects the other stuff in the universe, then it would be mysterious to us as to how something like that can happen. And we'd say, you bet, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Because both answers are correct. It's our perspective. It's how we choose to see the world and our relationship to the world.
Can science document this with instruments, or is it just with gut?
Well, George, you just hit the nail right on the head. One of the reasons that science and scientists have had such a hard time coming to these conclusions is this field of energy that is so new, by the way, that scientists have yet to agree upon a single term. So you'll hear former Apollo astronaut Ed Mitchell, for example, calls it nature's mind. I've shared the stage with him many times, and we've had these conversations. Stephen Hawking calls it the mind of God. Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, calls it the matrix. And the whole movie series was based on this field of the matrix.
Right.
Now we're calling it the divine matrix. Regardless of what we're calling it, it is an unconventional field of energy. It doesn't work the way TV and radio broadcasts work. It doesn't work the way electricity works. So our equipment simply has not been built to detect this kind of energy. But now that the energy is, we're beginning to understand it, and some of the open-minded, visionary physicists of our time are acknowledging the existence of this field. There are ways not to measure it directly, but rather indirectly. They say if the field exists, then we should see these kinds of results, and they're seeing precisely these kinds of results.
Why, Gregg, without training, do some of us believe it exists?
That is a good question. I think it's the way we're wired, George. Some of us were fortunate enough to be raised in families that were either accepting or open-minded enough, or, America is called the great melting pot of the world. We have cultural and spiritual traditions that converge here from many different parts of the world beyond the Western mindset, and they bring with them the ideas, the very basic idea that everything is connected. The Aboriginal traditions in Australia are some of the oldest documented continuous lineage of spirituality that we have in the world today. By some anthropological estimates, they go back over 50,000 years. For 50,000 years, their story has never changed. And they say that the world began with the existence of a web or a net of energy upon which everything is built. The Hindu traditions say the same thing. The great god Indra wove this web. It's called the abode of Indra. A very non-scientific language describing precisely what it is that we're finding today. So it may be that many of us were simply raised in families and cultures that acknowledge this. I'm just going to share an interesting story. I worked at Martin Marietta Defense Systems up in Denver, Colorado during the last years of the Cold War. And at the water fountain and over the coffee machine, our role in reality was the last thing that anybody would ever talk about. These were hardcore, brilliant minds, scientists, engineers, many of them former military. The day that I turned in my resignation, I left. And they all said, "What company are you going to?" thinking that I was going with a competitor. Mm-hmm. And I said, "Well, I'm going to go write a book." And they said, "Well, that's good, but, what are you going to do for a living?"
Yeah.
So there's a whole story going on there. But when they found that I was not going with the competition, they invited me to come in to my company and give a half-day seminar on company time on precisely the things that we're talking about now, so that my colleagues could see that I wasn't going with a competitor. But the reason I'm sharing the story is by the end of that program, people came out of the woodwork who I had worked with for years, day in and day out, and they said, Gregg, I never knew that you believe this way. I believe this way. My family believes this way. I was raised this way, and they never really felt safe talking about it in that culture. And I'm not singling that culture out as my experience, but I think it's true in much of our corporate culture today. So I think there's probably much more willingness in the broad general public to accept what our own science is showing us, because there's a sense within all of us that it exists anyway. I think that's why we're drawn to the kinds of movies like The Matrix. We just saw The Golden Compass last night about parallel universes, and The Last Memsey. These kinds of movies, we're drawn to see those because they do touch something very, very deep within us.
Well, as you work in your DVD, The Science of Miracles, what did you find to be one of the most fascinating aspects of that work?
The DVD was it was an opportunity in what I call an illustrated interview video format to bring together many of these ideas in about an hour in a really potent way to share with a broad general audience, kind of catch them up quickly with where our science is, how it fits within the context of some of our most ancient as well as cherished spiritual traditions. And I don't want to put you on the spot, George. Have you had a chance to see any of the video at all? Did you get? I
sure did. Yep. You sent it straight to the mailing address here in St. Louis, so we did pick it up.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. And the reason I'm asking, then you saw a section of a video clip in there of a healing that was documented inside the body of a living woman. Mm-hmm. It was filmed in a medicineless hospital in Beijing, China. And I think the opportunity for me to study with the man that filmed that footage, to learn the techniques that were shown in that film, and to know how real these effects can be, I think, in answer to your question, that was one of the most profound experiences for me. For listeners that haven't seen this film and are wondering what we're talking about, it is there. I was given permission to show a brief segment of a video that was filmed to handheld video. It's not professionally done. A medicineless hospital in Beijing, China, where practitioners are using ancient techniques to affect the healing, and in this case, it's the healing of a cancerous tumor inside the body of a living woman. So she's awake, she's conscious, she believes in the process. She's reclining. Through an ultrasound, we can look inside of her body real time, while the practitioners are applying the techniques that they have learned and preserved for thousands of years. And it's not time-lapse like a Discovery Channel flower, opening over the period of a week. This is real time. In 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the cancerous tumor literally fades and disappears from her body. And the success rate for these kinds of healings, this isn't a one-off healing, the success rate in this part of China is about 95% after 5 years if the people will follow the life-affirming protocols that they're taught, which are all things that we're learning now. It's about nutrition, movement, breath, diet, all those kinds of things.
Attitude?
Attitude, well, that's the piece that is we're just learning about now, because what these practitioners have done is they've created a feeling inside of their bodies, specifically in their hearts. They're feeling in their heart as if the woman is already healed. They're not judging this tumor as right, wrong, good, or bad. They're not telling it to go away. And there's a subtle and powerful difference here. They're not making the tumor disappear. They're choosing the healing of the woman, the health of the woman. And I've shown it to the United States Air Force Medical Corps in San Antonio, Texas. I've shown it at medical conferences all over the world for 5 years. And people say to me, Greg, that's a miracle. We'll have to study it. And it's only a miracle until we understand the technology.
When we come back, let's talk about the Global Coherence Project that you're working on and how some of us can participate in this, Greg. And also later on in our last hour, we'll open up the phone lines, questions for Gregg Braden, of course, and also maybe some of your miracle stories. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. I'm George Norrie. And Gregg Braden, our special guest tonight, will be back with Gregg as we talk more about the science of miracles right here on Coast to Coast AM. Gregg, during a 7-year period, you took 4 trips totaling about 80-plus days to monasteries in the Tibetan plateau. Why'd you go back so often?
We went back to experience and document the things that we had seen on each previous trip. It was interesting. There are 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries that we had the opportunity to explore. Some of them, George, were at elevations almost, we had to cross over 16,500 feet above sea level to get some of the passes to get to these monasteries. And it takes a long time to acclimate our bodies and just the sheer inaccessibility of some of these places. So it takes a long time to get there, and by the time we would get to some of these places, we would just begin to understand what was there, and we had to leave. So it made sense to go back once the camaraderie was established with the monks and the nuns and the abbots. There was a trust that was created, and in that trust, they were willing to take us places and show us the libraries. Some of these libraries, George, are 1,500 years old, that have the texts that describe in written terms the practices that they're still using in these places today. And these are the practices that we went to first to see if they really exist, secondly, to document them, and third, to integrate them into what I'm sharing through our work and with our listeners tonight.
I am really fascinated with your work about some of these ancient texts that somehow have been lost from us. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. We said early in the program that the fact, and it is now a fact, that there is a universal essence that connects us and everything in our world, and it is a fact that we can create experiences in our bodies, specifically in our heart. And I'm going to talk about why that's important in just a minute.
Sure.
But we can create those experiences in our heart that communicate directly with this field. George, when we're talking, this sounds like science fiction stuff, but it literally allows us to interrupt the flow of space and time and rearrange the stuff our world is made of. And this is the power that we are born with in this world. It's an understanding that sounds so foreign to the Western mindset and to our way of thinking, yet it's so deeply entrenched in the indigenous, the native, as well as the ancient spiritual traditions throughout the world, including the early Christian and pre-Christian and Jewish traditions before those texts were edited or completely removed in the case of the Western Bible in the 4th century during the time of the Emperor Constantine. So one of the things that a lot of people, we hear about the biblical edits, and if anyone's read, the Da Vinci Code, I haven't. I'm probably the only person that has not read
really?
the Da Vinci Code, but I understand they talk about those edits. And a lot of people believe this happened only in the Christian Bible. The Jewish Bible, beyond the Torah, was edited as well. The Torah, the first 5 books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those are intact. And the additional books that were canonized as the Jewish scripture, they were edited as well. Excuse me, and we know that these texts were edited because we have found the evidence of those edits in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library, the Coptic libraries, and in Cairo we've documented those Coptic libraries, and in the libraries of these monasteries in the Egyptian mountains. We find them in South America, in Bolivia and Peru, in the monasteries there, and we find them in the best preserved records in the highlands of central China and Tibet. And it appears, now the first time I had the opportunity to take one of these pilgrimages was 1998. And the monks that were there, they told us, they said that after the crucifixion of Jesus, that the followers were persecuted, and they fled the Holy Lands, and they went to 4 key locations. Now, this is a little 14-year-old monk telling me this through the translator. He's saying they went to 4 key locations, and in each of those locations, they carried copies of the same records, the same texts, that are essentially the equivalent of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we find today. One of those places was into the mountains of Egypt. One of those was in what we now know is the Tibetan Plateau in China. One of those places was in the southern, right along the southern border between Bolivia and Peru, and we've seen the monasteries there. And one of those places was right here in North America, in parts of south central North America, in areas of Kentucky and Tennessee. And believe it or not, some of those texts have actually been found and documented in those areas as well.
Well, are these texts, are they training guides, instruction sheets? What are they?
They're written in ancient Greek, Coptic, and Aramaic. And the Aramaic language, we get a lot of questions about this. They're the way that we can use the English alphabet and write Spanish or French words. The Aramaic alphabet, they are Hebrew letters that are used to create the Aramaic alphabet. They've been found. There are even records. I don't know. You may have heard about this, George. They found an abbreviated copy of the Ten Commandments carved in a 2,000-year-old stone on a reservation just south of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yes.
In both Greek and Hebrew letters. And the question is, who knew Greek and Hebrew in North America 2,000 years ago? And
exactly.
How did that get there? So the records appear to have been from a central wisdom, a common wisdom, a lineage. And after the crucifixion, that lineage of wisdom was dispersed, and we're now finding evidence of it in different places, but they're all saying essentially the same thing. And if you were to pull all of these records together, such as the ones we find in the libraries in Tibet, and we've actually got some images of those in the DVD. I wanted to put some of those images in there so people could get an idea of what they were like. But the bottom line is they say that we're a part of our world and all that we see, and that we have the ability, if we choose, to create experiences inside of our bodies that influence the world beyond our bodies. And this is the disconnect in Western science because, of course, based on the 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment, there's no stuff that connects everything else. And from that thinking, George, there's no medium to conduct the inner experience beyond our bodies. There's nothing for it to flow through into the world around us. What our own science, and this is going to lead into this coherence project you were asking me about, what we're finding, and for listeners that would like to believe that heart-based experience of feeling and belief affects our outer world and need a reason to really grasp that concept, what our own science has found is that our heart is the strongest electrical field generator in the body, and it is the strongest magnetic field generator in the body. And the reason that's important is because our physical world hinges largely on electrical and magnetic fields, the electromagnetic spectrum that we've all heard about. And any physics textbook, you go pull out your kid's physics textbook right now, and it'll tell you that if you change the electrical field of an atom, or you change the magnetic field of the atom, you will change that atom, the way it behaves, the way it expresses itself. And we've even got terms, the Zeeman effect and the Stark effect are the two effects that are documented as changing the electrical and the magnetic field of the atom. And this is important because the texts say if we change either the electrical field or the magnetic field, that we can change and influence the way that atom behaves. And our heart creates both, not just one or the other, both. But this is where it gets really interesting, George, and this is why feelings in our heart are so much more powerful than thoughts in our mind. Because our own science now is telling us that our heart creates electrical fields that are 60 to 100 times stronger than the fields of our brain, the same electrical fields of our brain.
Yeah, I believe that.
And magnetic fields 5,000 times stronger from our heart than those of the brain. And that explains to us why thoughts are powerful, and they can be important in our lives, but it's much easier to heal and create peace and alter our physical reality through our hearts than it is through our thoughts. And our hearts are where we have the feelings and the beliefs that communicate with this field that connects everything. And this is what ties it all together. This is what they're teaching in those monasteries. This is the great secret that everyone knows except us. In the indigenous traditions, right? I live in the high deserts of northern New Mexico. My wife and I live here, and we're surrounded by native traditions that they've held these ideas for hundreds, if not thousands, of years.
Well, Greg, why is it that when the heart stops to function, when a person dies, that these abilities seem to carry over?
Well, the heart is the way that we're expressing. What we know is that while science is still hard-pressed to prove the distinction between the body and the soul, they do acknowledge that there's an essence that cannot be accounted for in the physical body, our soul. And our soul is what is actually expressing through our bodies and specifically through our hearts. When the body is no longer there, what the studies show, and there are a lot of new theories about why this is happening, is that the essence, that field, continues. There are many places, George, where one topic tonight could be a whole program unto itself, and this is one of those places. But there are some really powerful. Well, I'll just say it right now. I'll just tell you where some of these theories are coming from. There is a growing body of mainstream scientific evidence that suggests that we may actually be living in what our own scientists are calling a virtual or a simulated reality.
Like the Matrix.
Well, not quite like that, but that's where it's along those ideas. The whole idea is that through our bodies here, we're expressing something that is not here. In other words, it's called non-local, and that's a term I know that comes up a lot on this program. And in another program, I'd love to go into the studies and the details about how real this possibility may be. But to get back to your question, it appears that even when our physical body is no longer here, that the stuff that's expressing, the intelligence that's expressing through our body continues. But the key to all this is the human heart. And the heart, in the Western way of thinking of things, has been almost completely discounted. We've become a very mental, left brain, male-dominated, schematically oriented, technologically based society, which is good, and it's led us to the place, George, where we must embrace the rest of our power to come full circle and survive what we've created, and that's the power of the intelligence of the human heart.
Well, we hear these phrases, my heart is heavy, you love someone through your heart. How did that all come about?
Well, I think I believe those come about through people expressing the only way they know how, in very non-technical terms, a very real feeling. This is where the action is. It's in what can technically be called a 7-layer liquid crystal oscillator in the center of our chest. It's not the most romantic-sounding term, but that's the function our heart is playing. And it's in our heart where the thoughts in our mind are combined with the emotions of the lower energy centers in our bodies. Our listeners are familiar with the 7 or 8 energy centers, the chakras that you see on the charts.
Right.
The heart, it's interesting, the top 3 are considered communication and logic and associated with the mind. The lower 3 are considered to be the power of human emotion that drives us forward in life. And the two are married together. If we know the techniques and understand the technology, the two are married in the heart. And when we marry thoughts and emotions, we create what we call a feeling. And by definition now, feeling is the union of thought and emotion. When we create the right kinds of feelings, that's the word that we call for the electrical and the magnetic fields that extend beyond our bodies and literally rearrange the stuff our world is made of. And this is how science is kind of backing in to the fact that we are connected with our world. That they're seeing that the human heart literally can change the physical stuff our world is made of through these electrical and magnetic fields. And they're also finding that we are literally tuned to layers of the atmosphere of the Earth through these fields, and that's bringing us around to the Global Coherence Project that you were asking about earlier.
Now, when science gets involved in this, do they attempt to debunk it at all?
They do, and this is what's so interesting. I've worked with a lot of, we talk about scientists, and there are some that would like to believe and just need a reason. There are some whose job it is to disprove everything, and I think this is how we get to the truth, George. This is how we find out what works and what doesn't, which of our spiritual traditions serve us and which of them are kind of make-believe, because there's a lot of stuff out there. But the scientists who I've worked with, some researchers in Northern California, who have documented the healing effects of healers from all over the world, such as the ones we spoke about earlier in China. And while the effects are there, there's such a disconnect in our way of thinking. It's hard for them to accept what it is that's happening. And by the way, what is happening tonight happens always. Our hours go by so quickly. We bumped up.
I know. We're getting into phone calls next hour already.
Well, we bumped up against the top of the hour, and I just wanted to mention the healing that was documented in this medicineless hospital in Beijing, China. The only purpose that I chose for me including that in this DVD and for even talking about it, it's not for people to find out where that place is and go and get healed. That's not what it's all about. It's to demonstrate in a very potent, graphic, less than 3-minute format that we have the power within us if we learn to focus this heart-based experience, that we can affect physical change, and it happens really fast. It doesn't have to happen over, long periods of time. This woman's body responded in less than 3 minutes. Her cancer was gone.
See, I happen to think, Greg, that so many people, let's say, who listen to this program, are more enlightened than those people who don't. And I'm beginning to find, and we'll probably talk about it when we come back after the break, that more and more that people who aren't enlightened tend to be unhappier.
I think that's true because they feel like victims of circumstances in our world. And what I want to say before the break about that healing, the bottom line to this language, to what's taught in the monasteries, to what the scientists are showing us, what's published in the journal Nature. There was an article published, the Weizmann Institute of Science. It's documented on our website. The title of the article they published in the journal Nature says the whole thing: observation affects reality. The bottom line is that when we observe in our heart the feeling, or we create the feeling, as if the outcome has already happened, as if the healing has already occurred or the peace has already occurred in our lives, that appears to be the language that this field recognizes, and it's then that it will mirror back in the quantum stuff that our reality is made of, what it is that we've just claimed in our hearts, and that's what our own science is showing us.
You're saying the field would recognize it, which makes it sound like it's got some intelligence behind it.
It's more than it's not a wish, and we're not asking, we're not saying, please let this thing happen, or I hope it happens, or, dear God, please bring this to me right now. Those are other forms of prayer, and they're valid, and they work in certain respects. This is a very empowered form of meditation, of prayer, a way of being, depending on your orientation. The bottom line is, when we create in our hearts, we feel as if we already have the things, the object of our prayer, or the object of that desire, that healing or that peace. That feeling translates into the electrical and magnetic fields that have a non-local effect that create local results.
When we come back, we will talk about the Global Coherence Project and what we can do to become part of it on Coast to Coast AM. Well, next hour, we'll open up the phone lines, give you an opportunity to talk with Gregg Braden. Perhaps you might want to share your miracle stories with us as well. We'll have him analyze it. That's next on Coast to Coast AM. Gregg, let's now talk about this initiative called the Global Coherence Project. What is it?
Well, what I'd like to do is we'll talk about what it is, the bottom line, and then a little bit about why it works. And then if people want to find out more, and there's obviously much more we'll be able to do here tonight. The bottom line of this project is that recent discoveries in the way the human heart works, and this is why I wanted to talk about the heart first. We know that our heart is in communication with our brain in every moment of every day. And the quality, George, of that communication between our hearts and our brains is called coherence. So the higher the quality of the signal between the heart and the brain, the greater the coherence. So that is one area of research that now is documented. It's been published in mainstream journals. We know that this is happening. The new discovery, relatively new, is that there are layers of Earth's atmosphere, particularly in the ionosphere, that happen to resonate within the same range of frequencies as our communication between our heart and our brain. So in other words, when we are experiencing a high level of coherence between our heart and our brain, we're actually tuning ourselves to a layer of the ionosphere in Earth's atmosphere, and in that way we are literally communicating with this living field of intelligence that envelops our world. And it opens up the door to tremendous possibilities in terms of the Gaia theories about Earth being a living entity
thing, yeah,
and our relationship to it. So that's a little background on what's happening. What is so exciting about this project, the Global Coherence Project, is that a series new discoveries have led to the development of devices, a series of devices that can now measure this coherence in the atmosphere and in the Earth, in the geomagnetic fields of the Earth and the atmosphere. So that's one piece of the project. The second piece is that an organization in Northern California, the Institute of Heart Math. Have you had, I'm sure you've interviewed them on this program in the past, or maybe Art has. But the Institute of Heart Math is a pioneering research organization studying the power of the human heart in what we call heart-based intelligence. In other words, they know that the heart does much more than simply pump blood through our bodies. You can build a machine to do that.
Right.
But there's something much, much more happening. So the Institute of Heart Math was founded in 1991. The core group was made of doctors, engineers, designers, programmers, researchers from many different walks of life and universities coming together to explore the power of the human heart. And they've been doing it very well documented in the Journal of American Medical Association and other journals since 1991. They now are teamed up with the physicist who has developed the sensors that will allow this measurement in the atmosphere of the Earth, and where HeartMath is bringing their technology to bear is that they have also designed the technology to tell us when we are most coherent, when that language between our heart and our brain is at its best, when it's optimized. So they are now training people through a number of different initiatives to know for certain. There's no guesswork here. It's not like people sit down at 12 noon and close their eyes and have a good feeling in their heart. They actually have the technology that will tell us when we are coherent between our heart and our brain, and the technology to be able to measure it directly in the atmosphere to know when that's happening and literally create a coherent field that we're all connected to in the Earth. And the value of doing this is that we know that when we're connected with this coherence, it affects many different areas of our lives. We know that it affects changes in our nervous system, our emotional states, the way we perform in sports, memory. In high coherence, there are fewer traffic accidents, for example, fewer emergency hospital room visits. So for the first time, George, what we've been able to do is validate on an individual basis when that coherence exists.
And track it.
Track it. And the project is just coming online. They're building 3 sensors to triangulate and know precisely how this is working. And then the project over 2008 and into 2009 will build many of these sensors all over the Earth, being able to track this range. What we know is that the ionosphere, it creates what researchers call a symphony of frequencies, and those frequencies range from about 0.01 hertz to about 300 hertz. And when our heart and our brains are in coherence, we're on the lower end of that spectrum, around 0.01 and up from there, the lower end of that spectrum. When peace is happening in broad geographic areas is when we have the highest degrees of coherence in this level of the atmosphere. When healing is happening in a human body, like the ones we see on the DVD, it's when the person receiving the healing is having this level of coherence. In other words, is in tune around this 0.01 hertz. So the Institute of Heart Math is pioneering this initiative, and for full transparency, I'm saying I'm on the advisory board of this project, and I'm very excited about it. It's the first time, while very well-intentioned initiatives have happened in the past and have helped us to understand that collectively we do have the ability to influence what happens in our world. This is the first time that we've ever been able to validate on an individual basis. In other words, a person can hold in their hand a relatively inexpensive device that tells them through a feedback mechanism when they are in coherence with this level of the atmosphere. And what the studies are showing is that not only do we influence the atmosphere on these levels, but the atmosphere influences us as well.
Now, what are some of the things people, once they're in tune with this coherence, could do?
Well, it optimizes our experience, our abilities, performance abilities. They've documented sports, memory, ESP, things like that. Those are all enhanced. It optimizes our nervous system and the communication between our brain. Even if we're not part of the project, everyone benefits to some degree because we're all part of this field. Our emotional states, our sleep states. I know a lot of people right now are saying that they feel like there's a disruption in their sleep patterns, that they feel that time is speeding up, for example. It's not necessarily a negative thing, but they're feeling that. They're feeling that life is happening very fast, too fast to keep up with, too many things going on. They're always behind. These are all symptoms of the chaos that's being reflected in this layer of the atmosphere. And when this layer changes, we change, and when we change, the layer changes. So I'm just going to give an example of something that happened back in the 1980s.
In the 80s, all right.
Where early experiments, and I know we've talked about these, George, in this program before, and other listeners have probably heard of the early experiments with the TM people, transcendental meditation.
Yes.
The city effect, when certain numbers of people are gathered together and they're trained to feel peace in their bodies, and peace is then reflected beyond their bodies and mirrored in a broad geographic area. These were powerful studies because they showed beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's an effect. We never had any way to document precisely whether or not coherence was happening and how to optimize this effect. But in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, for example, in 1988, published the results of a very famous study where 200 people were trained to feel peace during the Israeli-Lebanese War, the first Israeli-Lebanese War in the early 1980s. They were stationed in the war-torn areas, and while they were feeling that peace in a broad geographic area, statistically, what was found was that the number of traffic accidents declined, emergency hospital room visits declined, terrorist activities stopped. They dropped to zero. They completely stopped. And when the people, these 200 practitioners, stopped what they were doing, all of these statistics reversed. And they did this time and time again to make sure it wasn't just a fluke. And one of the things
that is amazing, Greg.
Well, it is. One of the things, now listeners may or may not be aware of this. You remember back in the late 1980s when there was a civilian airliner that was shot down over North Korea by the Soviet military. This was still during the Cold War, and there was so much tension, so much chaos happening emotionally. And after the Cold War, we found out what was happening behind the scenes. Obviously, we didn't know during the war itself. What we found out from the Soviets who were talking about this experience is they knew that they'd made a big mistake, obviously, when they shot down a civilian airliner. They believed that the United States would be so upset that we would launch an attack against them because we interpreted this civilian shoot-down as an act of war. In that thinking, they believed that it would be prudent for them to preempt us and push the button. And all of this, I mean, the synchronicity couldn't be better. All of this was happening during a weekend when one of these experiments was happening, where many people were feeling peace in their hearts, trained to feel peace. And it was reaching, the whole scenario was reaching a crescendo when the peace experiment started. And although we can't prove it scientifically, what we know is that everyone backed off of the trigger and calmer heads prevailed. And, of course, nobody knew this until after the Cold War, when the correlations were made and the Russians said, we were going to push the button because we thought you were going to push the button.
Yep. Why is it, though, Greg, that you have to keep up with it? You have to keep at it in order for it to work. Why can't you just do it once and stop?
George, that is, you couldn't have asked a more perfect question, because that is the beauty of what these ancient traditions are saying to us. Our scientists, when we do these experiments, we are coming from the place where we believe it's something you do in a moment in time, and then you stop. And the mystery is why all the statistics reverse after you stop. And the ancient traditions tell us that what we're doing in these experiments, it's not something that we're supposed to do in a moment in time. It's a way that we were designed to be. We're invited in these ancient traditions to live to the best of our abilities in this place where we feel that peace in our hearts, and in that way, the effect never ends. It's perpetual, and even though maybe on some days you're feeling more peaceful than I am, or our listeners are having a good day or a bad day, because so many people are doing this, to some degree there's ups and downs, but that peace is perpetuated every day. So the old studies that were done during the 80s, the ones I just shared, they proved that there's an effect. They were never able to document scientifically that we were actually experiencing what is now defined as coherence between our heart and our brain. The new Global Coherence Project now has the ability not only to document on an individual basis when we have that coherent experience personally, but it will show us in the atmosphere when enough of us have reached the levels where we're affecting this field, and this is the same field that the leaders of the nations are tapped into when they're making their decisions. It's the same fields that.
Unfortunately, most of them don't use it the right way.
Well, but this is the thing. We're all plugged into it, George. There is no them and us from the perspective of this field. There's a we, and we're all plugged into the same field, some consciously, some not. And what the studies have shown, and this is the beauty of these projects, is that a relatively few number of people may learn to speak the language of peace or healing that this field recognizes for the whole to benefit. And this is what these studies during the 80s were showing. In a broad geographic area, entire communities benefited from what only 200 practitioners were doing in a localized area because the effects are non-local. And that's precisely what this is showing. So the purpose is to facilitate a better understanding of our relationship to the earth, number one, and then to collaborate and effect to establish this global coherence at a time when decisions are being made from a place of confusion and chaos. When when this coherence is in place, we think better. We make better decisions, and we make decisions based more on what's called heart intelligence rather than the mind. And I've seen this work in a corporate boardroom, George. Not everyone has to know what's happening for this kind of an effect to be reflected. I've been in a corporate boardroom in an aerospace corporation, largely surrounded by former military professionals who were conditioned to arrive at decisions through a lot of anger, a lot of velocity in their voice, a lot of fist pounding on the tables. And what I've seen is one or two people in a boardroom can change the way they approach a problem, and that whole room will change without ever saying a word and explaining what you're doing because they all pick it up in that field.
Why is it, Gregg, though, that you need 200 people, you need 1,000 people to make the change? Why can't just one strong person do it?
I think one strong person could do it if there were a person among us who were tuned sufficiently and understood this principle sufficiently. Even those who are trained, George, we are so conditioned to believe. I think our conditioning is so strong that we are separate from everything else, that we are powerless beings in this world. Unless we're a master or an avatar, I think the conditioning is that. I'm just going to go back to the healing in the medicineless hospital. That's a beautiful example. There were 3 practitioners, that facilitated that healing. And I asked the man who filmed this, and I know him, I studied with him. His name is Luke Chen. He's a Qigong practitioner. Beautiful man, and they gave me permission to share this with our audiences. I asked Luke, I said, could that woman have healed herself without those practitioners? In other words, if this is so powerful, why did she need them to help her? And I think that's the same question you're asking me. And he smiled when I asked the question, and he said, Gregg, he said, it's interesting. We seem to feel more empowered when we're surrounded by people who believe as we do. That seems to give us permission to blossom in our own personal power. And I think the answer that he gave me that day is also the answer to what we're understanding about our power to bring about peace in our communities and healing in our bodies. It's the same field, peace and healing. It's the same field. And while to some people it sounds like wishful thinking, I mean, you look at what happened with the Berlin Wall. That is a beautiful example of where a shift in consciousness happened in there was a big ramp-up time. But once that shift, a certain number of people began to think and feel in a certain way, the conditions changed very, very quickly. And
Gregg,
I believe that's where we are right now.
Can evil be used the same way?
That's a beautiful question, and I'm going to give you I've asked the same question, and it's a powerful answer. And I'm going to try to get this in before our break at the top of the hour.
And if not, we'll just pick it back up.
Well, this is the beauty of the way this field appears to work, George. The field is what is called a neutral, unbiased field. And what that means is it reflects what the user gives it to work with. However, the user will experience the effects of what they put into the field before that field ever responds. So love, compassion, understanding, forgiveness, peace are self-perpetuating, expansive experiences. So those that feel those first, they benefit from that self-perpetuating, expansive, life-affirming experience, and it goes into the field. Those who are sending fear, anger, hate, jealousy, rage, death into that field, those are contracting, self-limiting experiences, and they experience those in their bodies before they have much effect in that field at all. And in that way, it's almost like nature's fail-safe.
All right, stay with us. Now, your phone calls and possibly your miracle stories next on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, here's the hour we've been waiting for. Your phone calls, your miracle stories with our special guest, Gregg Braden, on Coast to Coast AM next. Well, it's a very powerful tool once we know how to harness it, Gregg, isn't it?
Precisely. I think it's more than a tool. I think it's a way of being, George, and that, as I said earlier, I know when we do these programs, our time goes by so quickly, and for people who'd like to know more about this Global Coherence Project, the Institute of Heart Math has set up a special site that actually has a little slideshow that people can go through. And if you go down to about the middle of the page on our website, there's a link that will take you directly there. So people can find out how to participate, what it is, maybe answer some of their technical questions about this Global Coherence Project. They're going to begin probably sometime late spring, early summer. Some of the first monitoring devices are going to come online, and there'll be a live readout, so we can watch and see what this Global Coherence is actually doing.
All right, let's go to our West of the Rockies line. You're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hi. Good evening. George, it was a miracle that I got through. That was my miracle story.
All right, I love it.
but I wanted to, I read a book back in the 70s when I first moved to California. It was called Three Magic Words by U.S. Anderson. And in it, he describes the connection as universal subconscious mind, which means we're all connected. Everything that ever was, is, or will be, and everything that's animal, mineral, vegetable, plants, people, everything, are all connected like the Internet. And if you want something to manifest in your life, all you have to do is have a belief that it will happen and have the conviction behind it. Because our thoughts only last for approximately 3 seconds. And you have to repeat them. So it's negative over and over and over again, or it's positive over and over and over again. If you have the conviction behind whatever your belief is, and you did an example of this, by the way, when you had that Ouija board experiment you were going to do.
Right.
If you remember, you were talking about you didn't have any problem with the Ouija board, but you were afraid it might affect people around you.
Yeah, exactly.
So what did you do? You created all these negative things going on, all these people that you described that they were having because your belief system with the conviction behind it happened in your existence. So it's that simple, and all you need is one person to do it. I experiment all the time. After Rita and Katrina, the hurricanes, they were talking about the hurricane season is going to be worse the next year. I said, no, wait, it ain't going to happen. Forget it. And it didn't. And it didn't this year either.
Yeah, you might have done it.
I've told local talk show programs about that. And when the surge started over in Iraq, I said, it's going to work. And then you forget it. It's like ordering out of the old Sears catalog. You order it, you forget about it, and all of a sudden it manifests in your life. And you don't worry about how it gets there, or with a route it takes, or if it's an airplane or truck. It just gets there. And it's not a miracle. You just have a belief system that's going to be there. It's so simple. It's unbelievable. But you got to get the book, Three Magic Words. Look at it, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And Doctor, I love it because this is exactly what I've been believing since the 70s.
That's by Anderson, too, I believe. I have that book.
Yeah, U.S. Anderson.
Yep, exactly. What's your take on this, Gregg?
Well, I agree with everything he's saying. That the key, I know a lot of people are listening tonight, and it's important to be really, really clear what our own science is showing us. And this is the value of marrying science and spirituality. Scientists are now arriving at the understanding. They're saying, okay, the fields, everything's connected, and they're scratching their heads. They're saying, what do we do with it? And the ancient traditions were less concerned with proving that it exists and more about how we apply it in our lives. So the ancient traditions, the spiritual traditions, talk about how we use this field, and the science gives us the nuts and bolts as to why their instructions work. And what I'd like to emphasize is that rather than believing that it will happen, what the ancients say, what we learn in the monasteries, and what our own science now is showing, is to feel as if it has already happened. So giving thanks of gratitude and appreciation for what has already happened in our hearts, knowing that that's the language that has the non-local effects in the field that create the physical reality.
How important is intent here, Gregg?
It depends on how you define intent, George, and this is where there's so many words like will.
Oh, okay, let me give you an example.
Sure.
Someone has evil thoughts about another individual, but never follows through physically, holds back on it, but it's been sent out there. You know what I mean?
If it is a passing thought in a moment of frustration, for example, it probably has very little effect. If it's a thought that is, as we mentioned before the break, of anger, hate, retribution, jealousy, rage, that is harbored and nurtured and nourished over a period of time, it probably has a greater destruction and destructive power inside the body of the person that's having it than it's going to have on the person that it's directed to. And here's exactly the reason why. We could talk about this in another program. What our own science is showing is that for every thought, feeling, emotion, and belief that we create, there's a chemistry in our bodies, George, that matches that. So we literally have what can be considered hate chemistry. A lot of researching cancers are associating cancers with very specific forms of anger, unresolved anger in the person's body. So we all know negative emotions aren't good for us. Now we're getting specifics in terms of how they can affect our lives.
All right, let's go to our East of the Rockies line. You're on with Gregg Braden. Hi there.
Hi. Wow, there's so many things I could comment on.
Well, go
Even
ahead.
in the last
Enjoy.
sentence. Oh.
Well, who are we speaking with?
You're speaking to Vicki?
Hey, Vicki, how you doing?
Oh, real good. I've
to hear your
actually
voice.
seen many miracles myself that happened even instantaneously as I prayed. And it was from a time of, I get my belief from the promises of God, and I've memorized them, so they're always there. When negative things happen, those promises come up to remind me of what God says, and that I have His promises, but you have to meditate on it. You're right. You have to hold it in your heart all the time. But what I wanted to say is that there's a lot backing you in this, in the Word of God. First of all, He says to meditate on things that are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, and of good report. And if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, then you meditate on these things. Something else is probably even better that you would want to reflect upon right now is the Lord says, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And that seems to me to have a direct application to what you're covering right now.
Well, sure. You know, when we go back far enough, as different as the different spiritual traditions appear to be from one another today, when we go back to the root of where they come from, there's a common lineage of wisdom. And what you're saying right now is the language that was used then that describes what it is that the language of science is finding now.
And you're learning to have a practical application of it right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So from my perspective, there are different ways of saying precisely the same thing. And they actually say, when we go to the Lost Gospel of Thomas, for example, is one of the Gnostic texts that was edited from the modern Bible. It's believed to be a record of the actual words of Jesus as they were noted by the disciple, by Thomas. And in more than one place, they actually are giving us the instructions. They're telling us when thoughts and emotions are married into a single potent force, that force, although the emotion is happening in the realm of heaven, that the effect happens in the realm of earth, and they're saying exactly the same thing. So let me ask, what's an example of a miracle that you experienced?
I prayed for a neighbor when he had a blood clot in his leg, and I spoke to it as if I was speaking to just some spirit that was interfering with the health that God had given him, because we're all supposed to be whole. He says that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, always. And something comes along and tries to disrupt that. So I was speaking order into his body according to the promise of God. And he didn't have to go to the doctor the next day. The thing dissolved. It went away.
Sure, and that's, I hear a lot of that with women with breast cancer who are going in, and actually the day that they go in for the day they go in for their surgery, for mastectomy, they ask the doctor, they'll say, well, can you do one more x-ray just to make sure? And the doctors will do the x-ray. And while their friends and family have knowingly or not, they have used this mode of communicating with the stuff everything is made of, and all of a sudden there's no reason to have the surgery. Doctors call it a miracle. It's only a miracle until we understand our relationship to the field. And what our own science is doing is they're giving us the language in the Western terminology that has been mystical in our most cherished spiritual traditions. And when we understand more of how this field works, we understand more of the right things to do and how to create these effects consistently and predictably and repeatedly. And I think it brings us all closer. We feel closer to our world and one another and to a higher power.
Gregg, if this field exists, and you and I both believe it does, to me, it tells me that something of some tremendous design created it and put it there.
Absolutely, George. And I think the evidence, I mentioned this a little earlier, the evidence, mainstream scientists are now devising mathematical proofs to explore whether or not this is an intentional field. And the bottom line is that the statistics are more in favor of this field being intentional than it being a random or just a fluke. And in that intentionality, it implies an intelligence that underlies that. And where and how that intelligence comes about is something I think that's what I think this time in history is all about. We're finding that we're part of a greater existence, and that's what changes everything.
Let's go to our first-time caller line. You're on with Gregg Braden on Coast to Coast.
Hi, I'm Laura from North Carolina.
Hey, Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Hi. I wanted to ask Gregg if he thought that if we could ever become so highly spiritually evolved that we could just separate our spirits from our bodies if we wanted to. That is, if we were very ill or so aged or so heartbroken and unhappy that we could just walk out of our bodies instead of waiting to die naturally.
You know, it's an interesting question, and it's not as far-fetched as it might sound to some people, because in other cultures, this is precisely what they do.
Oh, really?
They do this in Native American tradition, not all Native American, but some Native American traditions. The first time I saw it was in Egypt, and I saw the instructions for how this is done inscribed in a limestone tablet about 300 feet underneath the surface of the desert outside of Cairo in a temple that had just been unearthed. And the translator that was with us, I asked, what is it that we're seeing here? And it was actually the description of, it's called letting go. To be in this world right now requires a focus of holding our awareness present in holding it in this physical body. And we're so accustomed to it, Laura, that we don't even know we have that focus. But there is in other words, it's just so much a part of who we are. But there is a technique or techniques where when someone, they don't have to be sick, they can just be tired of being in this world, and they go into an altered state, they let go of that focus, and when they let go, they end their physical life here, and that essence moves on. So the answer, that's a long answer, a short question.
Yeah, it was a beautiful answer. It's a beautiful. I would like to have the instructions.
Yeah. Where are the instructions?
One of the places where you see it referenced is in the Egyptian Book of Living and Dying, in the Ani papyrus. If you're familiar with the Ani, it's pronounced Ani papyrus, or the Ani tablets. Is where they show the instructions, and they show actually the steps that we go through to separate our soul from our body. And the flip side of that is that many of the lost texts that are now being recovered show that our bodies and souls are separate from one another. And when the first of our kind was created, that the bodies were created, but they had to change the formula for the body to hold the power of our soul in this world, because the essence of our soul is such a powerful essence, not any physical vehicle could hold it. So there's another book that is entitled The Other Bible. It was put out by HarperCollins. It's a collection of edited texts from the Gnostic, Jewish, and Christian traditions that didn't make it into the mainstream canon. And in those texts, and some of the Hebrew texts, they actually describe how difficult it was with the first of our kind to create a vehicle. In other words, to get the genetic formula right to hold the power of the spirit in this physical world. It's fascinating.
Next up, wild card line, your turn.
Yeah, George?
Yes, sir.
Do you want to do an experiment real quick? Because this guy's talking about everything I've been doing for 10 days, and I got records, and I got audio, video, and I can't send them through the email. It won't let me. But if you want to do an experiment, I've got 6 pages in my fax machine, and either your fax machine is going to break or my fax machine is going to break, and that's an experiment. Do you want to do it?
No, what do you mean it's going to break? Explain that.
I don't know. I've been trying to get you my evidence for 10 days, and I can't get my email to take it. And every time it'll send an email if I don't attach my evidence. But if I attach my evidence, it won't send it. And I can't understand why. I've done it 1,000 times. And I got 6 pages of evidence, but are handwritten notes. And I've been writing things down before people have been saying them. Some things on there you're going to see happen after you get the facts. And some things have already happened. Some things are going to mean something, and some things are not going to mean anything at all. But it's all going to be true, and it's all going to be false. And if you understand that, you're better off than I am, because I'm so confused right now. And but I want to do a test, and I've got some fax machine ready to fax. If you'll give me a fax number, I'll send them to you.
What I tell you what there, Michael, I can't give you a fax number over the air, or I'll get stuck with zillions of faxes from all over the place.
Believe it or not, George, I knew you were going to say that.
Okay. I had no choice. But it was an interesting concept. Have you done experiments recently, Gregg, in this area? We have, constantly.
I know that you have, and the field that we're talking about, it's so fundamental to everything that we're talking about. It's the reason that remote viewing works the way it does, and that's why there are no secrets. It makes some people crazy, and it thrills other people to no end. It's why I tell author friends of mine, I say the moment you get an idea for a book, or musician friends, when you get an idea for a song, if you've got that idea, it's out there, and other people are working on it just as you are. And if you don't act on it now, you're going to see your book show up on Amazon, within 6 months, and it was your idea. And the same with music. So we do experiments anecdotally that way. I'm not seriously involved with any research projects using these right now.
Quick one from you, Wildcard Line. You're on with us. Hello there.
George and Gregg, beautiful topic, extremely relevant to the issues that we're facing in the world today.
Indeed.
First, I wanted to comment on, Gregg, you were talking about using gratitude as a tool to enhance the effectiveness of prayer, is what I think you're getting at. And that is similar to the Hawaiian concept of what's called ano ano.
Absolutely.
That the fruit is already in the seed. That everything, and this can be used by all listeners, I used it to make this phone call tonight, that simply thank God for what we want, that what we want we already have, and that all we need to do is nurture that seed, and the fruit is already there, and we will have it. Gregg, my question to you is with regards to using some of this ancient knowledge to not only prove from a theoretical standpoint, but also to gain knowledge from a practical standpoint with regards to our physical world, such as we're facing this sun...
Solars?
Thank you. 24 that's going on right now,
Yep.
And how certain ancient cultures had knowledge of this and whatnot. And the Hawaiians, this is also with regards to string theory, had a concept of aka chords, a.k.a.
I'm very familiar with those.
Okay, I'll let you answer both of those when we come back, Gregg. Well, I'll be back in Los Angeles for our Monday program, and our guest will be L.A. Marzulli, the Luciferian Conspiracy. We'll be back with final phone calls with Gregg Braden on Coast to Coast AM. Gregg, let's go back to you and see if you can react to the last caller talking about those, aka chords?
Well, I made just a couple of notes, and I'm not sure that the last comment was actually a question, but the
more of a comment, yeah.
Well, the caller, he was speaking about, first of all, about the power of gratitude, and it's interesting, and this is the reason we wanted to lay out some of this information first so we could tie back into it through the evening. The researchers at the Institute of Heart Math have found that in the English language, the words gratitude and appreciation are the two words that best describe the optimum feeling that we can have in our hearts that create that coherence between the heart and the mind, or the heart and the brain that we were talking about. In other words, every moment of every day, our heart is sending a signal to our brain, and it's either flooding our bodies with life-affirming or life-denying chemistry. Gratitude and appreciation are the words that describe the feeling that sends the optimal signals to our brain to to tell our brain to give us the powerfully enhanced immune systems and DHEA levels that are sky high. And this is what's been documented under laboratory conditions. So the ancients, they didn't say it in technical words. They just said, feel these feelings, and you'll create good things in your life. And now we know that this is why they were saying these things. We also know that when we have those experiences in our heart, as we mentioned earlier, we're creating the electrical and the magnetic fields in our heart that extend both into the physical matter, to the atoms, as well as into the quantum field of possibilities. And the quantum fields of possibilities appear to congeal, George, around the template or the blueprint of these fields to create in our world what it is that we just claimed in our hearts. And the beauty is we don't have to know any of it. We just give thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the healing that's already happened, the abundance that's already in our lives, the relationships that already support us, the peace in our communities or our families or our nations. And in that way, we're creating that effect that shows us precisely what it is that we've claimed.
All right, let's go back to the phone's wildcard line. Take it away.
Hi, is it me?
Yes, me.
Oh, hi, Greg. Hi, George.
Hey.
Who are we speaking to?
Oh, this is Julie. I'm in Oregon.
Hey, Julie.
Hi. My question for Greg tonight was, has he ever run across someone who perhaps accidentally taps into this energy and levitates, or is, levitates? That's my question, I guess.
Well, first of all, I think it's impossible to accidentally tap into it. It's our birthright. It's part of who we are. We may or may not be aware of it. And what we're finding is that, in my experience, the only time people can tap this field is when they're ready to experience it. The only levitation I've ever seen is in the monasteries in Tibet. I haven't seen it here in North America. I've seen people that claim to, and I've never really been able to validate that that's what was happening. But we have seen it in the monasteries in Tibet, and as I mentioned earlier, this is the value of going into a living culture rather than seeing it on a temple wall. I could ask them, how did you do that? And the bottom line is they say they create a feeling. It's all done through a feeling. Right.
And extreme joy or extreme sorrow.
Well, when we find these things historically, and this is interesting, Julia, it typically comes up in what are called ecstatic experiences, usually in religious or spiritual settings. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason for that is because the diversions are absent that keep us from that kind of focus. So I'm not saying, I don't think we have to go into a cave and live there for 20 years or into a monastery in the middle of nowhere at 18,000 feet above sea level to have these experiences. It's just those conditions are set up for that. But
and you think some people are more in tune with it than other people?
They are, but our conditioning is so powerful. Even people that honestly believe 100% in their conscious minds of the connections that we're talking about tonight, what we're finding is the subconscious conditioning in our culture is so powerful, and that we are so powerfully conditioned to believe that we are powerless, that we are victims, and that we are disconnected from the world around us, that there's a lot of that we have to heal to have these kinds of experiences.
So no accidents, huh?
I think if someone has these, they could happen spontaneously, and what it means is that consciously or not, you've arrived at, or whoever's having the experience has arrived at a point in their lives where they're ready to experience the fullness of our relationship to the world. This is the beauty. When we look at quantum particles, and we've talked about this in other programs, quantum particles do seemingly miraculous things. They can be in many places at once. They communicate with themselves over long distance. They're not limited by time. They can experience the past as well as the future. And what the scientists now are asking is, if quantum particles can do that, and we're made of those particles, then why can't we do the same thing? And what it appears the answer to that is that we are governed in part by our beliefs. Some of them are conscious, some are subconscious, some are conditioned by our culture and our family, some by personal experience. And as we come to the point individually and collectively where we heal those experiences, it opens the door to the fullness of our experience and empowers us to participate. Now, I'm going to use that word very consciously. It's not about control or manipulation or imposing our will, but to participate in the way this world unfolds, and that goes from the peace between nations and the way that this world unfolds over these next few years to the healing in our bodies.
All right, back to the phones again. Wild card line. Hello there. Where are you calling from?
Delani calling from Miami.
Hey, Johan, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to ask Greg if how do you manifest or re-experience a spiritual experience using heart coherence? Because I use biofeedback. I don't know if you heard of the Wild Divine game or something like that.
I have heard Wild Divine, absolutely.
And I've had a pretty incredible experience using that. And it was a couple of years ago, but I'm still like trying to figure out how it happened. I was for real. I was doing a heart meditation. It's called the heart breath or something like that.
Yes.
And it was focused on compassion through the heart. And when that happened, I saw gold light going over my body. And then a being came to me, and it was Jesus Christ. I'm a Buddhist, so when I saw this, I was pretty amazed, you know.
So, and so the question is, how do you recreate the experiences? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, it is.
First of all, for listeners that may not be familiar, Wild Divine is it's an interactive game that was created a few years ago. I actually had a prototype that I was asked to evaluate, where a number of different feedback techniques, ranging from breath to pulse sensors, are used to allow you to move through progressively higher stages in the game. So only when your heart rate gets to a certain place or you breathe a certain way will the sensor pick that up and then allow you to go to the next level. And the experiences that people have along the way, they're certainly individual experiences. And I would imagine to recreate that, now that you've opened the door to the possibility, it would be relatively easy to go back and have the same experience, or it may happen spontaneously. Once we have the experience and we know it's possible, that seems to free us to have those experiences spontaneously, maybe in our dreams, or you might be walking through a forest not thinking about these things, and you look at the beauty of the sky and the world around you, and in that elation, those experiences happen spontaneously. But I think that we have the experiences we need when they're important for us to have them, and if you never have that experience again, it may be that one time was all you needed to tell you whatever it was that experience told you and what it meant to you in your life.
All right, let's go to our west of the Rockies, Greg. You're on the air with us. Hi there.
George.
Yeah, hi.
Okay, Steve here in Campbell, California. I'm so glad to get in touch with you guys.
Sure.
I have an engineering degree, and my freshman year physics course, the first day was the Michelson-Morley experiment.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, why are they saying you can't do something the first day?
How interesting.
It always haunted with me.
Well, so that was, you had a progressive science course that they're telling you about that. Did they also tell you about the follow-up experiment in 1986?
Well, no. This was before 1986.
Oh, okay.
But the big question that I have: has anybody done any historic research on who Michelson and Morley were, religiously and politically?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know who they were religiously. I know that, and I don't know who they were politically. I know that they were very innovative. I think the experiment was a good experiment. I think it was poorly interpreted. And the reason I say that is because the same experiment was recreated with better equipment, and it produced the results that they had expected and predicted 100 years, a little over 100 years prior. So they were disappointed. They had first done this experiment in 1881, and they did it for a public audience again in 1887. I had the same experience both times. So if you're asking if they had a certain bias toward the existence or non-existence of the field, I can't answer that question. It's a good question.
Also, another observation. This is not as miraculous as healing, but I've often seen that craps tables in Vegas, when a table gets hot, suddenly the probabilities go out the window and people start winning like crazy.
Yeah.
And then the pit boss will show up and he'll act this very cold, authoritative figure and start standing around people, and suddenly
he's the cooler.
Crapping out.
Yeah, he's the
and
cooler.
I'm just thinking, is there just postulates that are being thrown out there?
No, there's an effect, and studies have shown that the effect is consistent. It's predictable because these are anecdotal, impractical applications showing where the discussion we're having tonight touches every aspect of our lives. Everything is connected. We are influencing the world around us. If people are saying, "I hope I get a number when I throw these dice," they're probably not going to have the effect. If they're feeling the elation of having 2 or 3 numbers that have already come up, then that expectation certainly sets up a bias in the field, and that's what the experiments show. That is how we are actually influencing the world around us, and having a pit boss come over kind of throws a damper on the whole thing.
Let's go to Vancouver, International Line. You're on the air with us. Hello there.
Hi, George and Greg. This is Candy.
Hi, Candy.
And Candy?
Candy.
Candy, it's good to hear your voice.
Thanks. I live on the edge of the wilderness up here. It's just wonderful. I'm so thrilled to hear this program. You've described a focus that I've had ever since I was a little girl, actually. And I just wanted to ask about if you've done any experiments with animals. I work with animals, animal behavior, police dogs. I work with, I help them to track, actually, and do some tracking with the police and whatnot.
And when you say work with animals, in what area, Candy?
Well, tracking, in the sense of communicating with the animals. They have to describe what they're doing, and I have to understand what they're doing, what they see, where they're going, and to find lost people, basically, for search and rescue work.
Have you gotten into the animal area, Greg? I'm not sure you have.
I personally have not done the research, but I'm in touch with a lot of people. Obviously, when we do this work, a lot of people come into the fold, and there's some very good studies that are showing that, certainly animals are very much a part of the field. What sets them apart from us is they do not seem to have the judgment or the bias that we do, so they're much more open and attuned to the field. And some of the experiments, you may have heard of some of these, George, or maybe some of your guests have talked about the experiments that were done where dogs were monitored in the home while their owners were in the office at work. Mm-hmm. And the dogs would be sleeping or eating or whatever they were doing. When the owner began packing the desk at work and packing the briefcase and had the intention of coming home, the dogs walked over, and they were at the door waiting for their owners to be there before, in some cases 30, 40 minutes before the owners ever got there, because in the field they knew that they were already connected. They already knew that was happening. The Institute of Heart Math did a wonderful experiment that's up on their website, where an individual, a young boy who was attuned to a dog named Mabel, and I met Mabel before she left this world, so I know who she is. They were in separate rooms, and they were being monitored. And when the boy walked into the room, immediately their heart rhythms sync together, and they become very attuned to one another in the room. And when the boy in his mind says, "I'm going to get up and leave the room," he doesn't vocalize it. He hasn't even moved yet. He has the intention that he's going to do it. That intention is enough to disrupt that coherence between the boy and the dog's heart rhythms go all over the place because he knows he's about to lose his friend. He's going to be alone. And for these things to happen, there must be a conduit that carries our inner experiences into the world and between us. And this is one of the ways, indirectly, this field is being validated.
It happens with plants, too.
Absolutely. That was the work of Cleve Baxter, who I had the opportunity to spend some time with.
And Christopher Bird, I believe, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Cleve Baxter was doing the first polygraph experiments for the military back in the 1940s, when he was working with plants, had his plants hooked up to a primitive polygraph. An insect, I believe it was a spider, crawled across his lab desk, and even though he never killed the spider, in his mind he had the intention to do it, and the plants went nuts. And the readings were on the screen, and he said, wow, maybe there's something going on here. And that led to Peter Tompkins' book, The Secret Life of Plants, which then led to the research and a subsequent book, The Secret Life of Your Cells, that didn't, in my opinion, didn't get the press and the visibility that it should have, but it's very good work.
Fascinating. Let's go east to the Rockies. One or two more questions. We're done. Go ahead.
Hey, George, Greg, good morning.
Well, good morning. Who are we speaking with?
John in Atlanta.
John,
okay,
good to hear
minute and a half to go. Go ahead, John.
Okay, well, I can say so many things. But, Greg, I think it was you that was on the program maybe 5 years ago. I was in about a half-conscious state, and I believe you were talking about the DNA molecule, the DNA strands being unraveled in certain states of mind. They would become less wrapped.
I remember that night, and it was 2004. I remember that night precisely.
Yes, and I thought that was fascinating. I believe you said something about our physicality becoming less dense when our DNA strands become less tight in a certain state of mind, in a peaceful state of mind.
No, what did you mean by that, Greg? Because we only have 30 seconds left.
Again, this gentleman named Roland McCready had published the studies, and these studies, we've got the links on our website as well under references.
Which may have crashed tonight, by the way.
We gave them a heads up, so they got some extra horsepower out there, some extra bandwidth. But the bottom line is what they found was that in the presence of positive emotions that we call gratitude, appreciation, love, and compassion, the DNA strands in the cells relax. And when they're relaxed, we have enhanced immune systems, high hormone levels of DHEA, life-affirming hormones, and in the presence of anger, jealousy, hate, rage.
Well, the field, Gregory, is immense. We're out of time, my friend. Greg Braden, our guest, to the science of miracles. That's how fast it went by.
Oh, it did. I was looking. I thought we had another 5 minutes. All right, guys.
Oh, that's it. Thanks, my friend. For Karis Coburn, Wayne Roberts, Dan Galante, Steve Carr, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Gina Salvati, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesor, Ross Mitchell, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell. I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there at Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.